If you want to know what really gets destroyed in an economic collapse, do not start with the stock market. Do not start with the currency chart. Do not start with the news footage of riots, bank lines, or politicians pretending that everything is temporary. Start with the middle-class living room. Start with the house note. Start with the car in the driveway. Start with the insurance folder in the cabinet. Start with the diploma framed on the wall. Start with the financed appliances, the renovated kitchen, the carefully purchased signs of a responsible life. That is where the real autopsy begins, because a collapse does not just bankrupt nations. It strands purchases. It turns the most respectable forms of middle-class prudence into dead weight. That is the part almost nobody teaches. Honestly, people think collapse is mainly about destruction, burning buildings, closed stores, empty streets. Sometimes it looks like that. But the deeper version is quieter and much crueler. Your house is still standing, your car still starts. At least for a while, your insurance contract still exists. Your degree is still yours, your furniture still fills the room. Nothing appears broken in the physical sense. And yet, step by step, each thing stops doing the economic job it was bought to do. That is collapse in its most important form, not the disappearance of objects. The disappearance of function. I have spent my life studying not only businesses, but systems. The question that interests me is never just whether an asset exists. The real question is what conditions must remain intact for that asset to stay useful. That is where most people make the biggest mistake of their financial lives. They do not buy objects, they buy assumptions, they buy a house, but underneath the house, they are really buying the assumption of stable mortgage markets, stable property taxes, stable employment, liquid resale markets, predictable credit, and a currency that will continue meaning roughly what it means today. They buy a new car, but underneath the car, they are really buying the assumption of available fuel, accessible spare parts, insurable roads, affordable maintenance, and the ability to keep paying for the debt attached to it. They buy life insurance, annuities, pensions, and retirement products. But underneath those contracts, they are really buying the assumption that institutions will remain solvent, that governments will not change the rules in desperation, and that the currency those contracts eventually pay out in will still buy something worth having. They buy a degree. But underneath the credential, they are buying the assumption that the economy they are preparing for will still exist when they need it. They buy a consumer lifestyle. But underneath the objects, they are buying the assumption that tomorrow's income, tomorrow's financing, and tomorrow's market for those goods will resemble today. That is the hidden structure. The middle class thinks it owns assets. Very often it really owns a pile of delayed dependency. And when the system breaks, dependency gets exposed. That is why history keeps destroying the same category of people in the same way. Not the poorest. The poor have little to lose and were never fully invited into the formal promise system in the first place. Not the richest. The rich usually hold enough liquidity, enough optionality, enough hard claims, enough international reach, and enough legal flexibility to survive a break. The middle class gets hit because it is the class most fully invested in normality. That is the real mechanism. It is the class built on contracts, and contracts are wonderful things until the system that honors them starts negotiating with reality from a position of weakness. I want you to think about Argentina in late 2001, a woman with a decent job, a respectable apartment, a car bought on installments, a vacation property purchased at what was supposed to be the smart point in the cycle, a life insurance policy dutifully funded for over a decade, a closet and home filled with the ordinary furniture of upward progress. Then the banking system freezes, the peg breaks, the currency collapses, the government panics, and suddenly she stands in a room full of everything she owns and begins realizing that ownership and usefulness are not the same thing. Fay file site Fay turn 27 file 0 Fay, that is the first truth collapse teaches. Usefulness is conditional, and the conditions are often far more fragile than the public was encouraged to believe. The first major purchase that becomes useless in collapse is real estate bought at the wrong point in the cycle and financed in the wrong structure. People hate hearing that because they have been trained to worship real estate as if it were natural law. They are not making more land. Your home is your greatest asset. Real estate always comes back. These are not facts. These are slogans. A slogan can survive for decades and still fail exactly when you need it most. I have never disliked real estate as an idea. Real estate can be excellent. But real estate is never just a building. It is a financing structure wearing a roof. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this discussion. If I buy a farm with cash, low carrying costs, and strong productive value, that is one thing. If I buy an apartment at the peak of a credit boom with a large mortgage, rising taxes, unstable income assumptions, and confidence that the next buyer will always be there, that is something else entirely. One is an asset. The other is a leveraged assumption about normality. And leveraged assumptions about normality are exactly what collapse punishes. That is what Japan taught in the early 1990s. The country had spent a decade turning real estate into civic religion. Prices rose so far that absurdity itself became respectable. Then the bubble broke, and it did not heal in a year or even 5. In many places it bled for decades. Families discovered that a home can become a prison when you owe more than it is worth and cannot sell without crystallizing the damage. They discovered that a property can remain physically intact while becoming economically dead. That is not a contradiction. That is how wrong cycle real estate behaves. America learned the same lesson in 2008 with more vulgar speed. People were told that housing was safety, leverage was manageable, and appreciation was a birthright. Then credit tightened, prices fell, and millions found out that the dream of ownership had become a negative. Equity trap. Their house still stood. Their mortgage did too. But the exit was gone. That is when the asset becomes useless in the way that matters most. Not because you cannot sleep in it, because it no longer performs the financial job you bought it for. You cannot liquidate it. You cannot borrow against it safely. You cannot rely on it for mobility. You cannot even always carry it. Because the taxes, maintenance, insurance, and debt payments continue regardless of whether the market would pay you anything reasonable for it. That is where Greece becomes such an important case. Property values fell. Yes, but even more destructive was the freeze. No buyers, no market depth. Rising taxes from a desperate state. Owners trapped inside an asset that still required care but could no longer be converted into freedom. That is the dirty secret of real estate in a collapse. It does not need to fall to zero to become functionally useless. It only needs to become illiquid at the same time the carrying burden remains. That is enough. The middle class is taught to think of home ownership as security in a true breakdown. It can become geographic captivity. Now let me sharpen the mechanism. A house bought at the wrong time is not just a bet on the value of land. It is a bet on liquidity, a bet on credit, a bet on tax policy, a bet on wage continuity, a bet on the existence of buyers, a bet on the existence of banks willing to intermediate the next transaction. That is a lot of hidden bets sitting inside one purchase, and when systems crack, hidden bets get called all at once. That is why the first category fails so completely. The second purchase that collapse turns useless is the new automobile bought on credit. This one is more humiliating because a car feels so practical. People do not romanticize it in the same mythic way they romanticize a house. They say, I need the car. It gets me to work. It gives me mobility. It is necessary. Fine. Sometimes it is necessary that does not make it resilient. A car is not a self-contained asset. It is a dependent machine. It depends on fuel. It depends on roads. It depends on spare parts. It depends on insurance. It depends on a functioning import channel. It depends on your income stream being intact enough to support the debt you took on to buy it. Take away one of those pillars and the car weakens. Take away several. And what looked like mobility becomes a 2-ton monument to sunk cost. Venezuela made this brutally clear. People bought newer vehicles because inflation made them think a physical asset was safer than holding currency. That logic was not entirely irrational at first. Then the wider system deteriorated. Fuel became scarce in an oil-rich nation. Spare parts vanished. Tires became luxury goods. Repair chains broke. Insurance ceased to mean anything practical. And suddenly the new car bought as a prudent inflation hedge became a useless shell sitting in the driveway. The debt survived longer than the utility did. That is the line that matters. Collapse destroys middle-class families by preserving their obligations longer than their usefulness. Cuba, after the Soviet breakup, showed a related truth. The vehicle is only as alive as the ecosystem around it. If the supply chain dies, the car dies with it, even if the engine block is still sitting there physically present. A person with an old paid-off car may suffer inconvenience. A person with a newer finance car often suffers something worse. A payment obligation attached to declining function, That is where uselessness really lives. And here again, the hidden structure matters. When you buy a car on credit, you are not buying transport. You are buying a contract on the continuation of the transport ecosystem, fuel availability, road maintenance, import continuity, technician availability, currency stability, household cash flow. Those are the true components. Without them, the car becomes decorative debt. The middle class is told the car is part of a respectable life. In collapse, respectability has very little horsepower. The third purchase that becomes useless is the one I think hurts the most psychologically: long-term financial promises, life insurance, annuities, pension contributions, retirement accounts whose virtue is sold entirely on the assumption that future money will be meaningful and future institutions will remain honest enough to honor what they promised. This category hurts the most because it punishes the people who did exactly what they were told. Not the speculators, not the gamblers, not the flashy fools, the patient savers, the people who skip consumption in the present to secure the future. This is where collapse becomes morally offensive. Not because it is unfair in some abstract sense, because it reveals that the people most loyal to the system were often the most exposed to it. Weimar Germany remains the purest historical lesson: people saved in marks. Insurers promised payouts in marks. Pensioners were paid in marks. The contracts were honored in the narrow legal sense. The institutions did not necessarily refuse the money. The money itself had become useless. That is the cruel genius of currency debasement. It lets the promise appear intact while destroying the thing promised. A life insurance contract worth a house in one decade paid out enough for groceries in the next. A civil servant's pension still arrived, but it could not command bread. Technically, the system had not lied. Functionally, it had vaporized the saver. That is the mechanism. Not default denominator collapse. Argentina showed the modern version when private pensions were effectively absorbed and degraded under political pressure. Lebanon showed the banking version when dollar-denominated savings were frozen, devalued, and made hostage to a system that continued to look like a banking system right up until depositors discovered it was mostly a theater set. This is why I say long-term financial products are not assets in the ordinary sense. They are delayed trust agreements. They say, sacrifice now, and the system will reward you later. That is a beautiful proposition in a stable order. It is a lethal proposition in a disintegrating one, because the future payment does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives through a chain, a solvent institution, a stable legal system, a currency with purchasing power, a government willing not to change the rules in emergency, a financial intermediary still capable of functioning. Every one of those links is exactly what collapse threatens. That is why this category fails so reliably, not because prudence is stupid, because prudence outsourced through fragile institutions becomes fragility disguised as responsibility. That is the lesson. If you want to know why collapses are remembered so bitterly by the middle class, this is one major reason. They are told for decades that the reward for obedience is future safety. Then the future arrives and the safety does not. The fourth purchase is the university degree financed as a stable route into the formal economy. Now, I need to be precise here because knowledge is never useless. Skill is never useless. The ability to think, analyze, communicate, and solve problems carries value in any regime. But a credential is not the same thing as skill. A degree is a labor. Market coupon, its value depends on a specific economic order, continuing to reward the category of work it was designed to signal. That is a much more fragile proposition than people admit. The Soviet collapse exposed this in one form: engineers, scientists, administrators, professors, and bureaucrats had credentials perfectly adapted to the old system. Then the old system disappeared. The degree remained. The labor market that gave the degree meaning did not. That is how a credential becomes useless without becoming false. It is still real. It is just attached to a vanished lock. Greece and Spain taught the same lesson to another generation. Families borrowed, sacrificed, and organized their lives around higher education as the pathway into stability. Then the youth labor market imploded. The degree holder was not suddenly ignorant. He was simply trained for an economy that no longer had enough room to reward what the degree signaled. That distinction matters greatly because it tells you what the actual risk is. The risk is not education. The risk is overpaying for a credential whose value is entirely dependent on systemic continuity. When the formal economy shrinks, when hiring freezes, when public or corporate employers disappear, when whole industries contract, then the degree does not become worthless in some philosophical sense. It becomes economically stranded. Its value cannot be realized where and when it was meant to be. And if debt was taken on to acquire it, then the same pattern appears again. The obligation survives, the function does not. That is the recurring cruelty. The middle class is told that the credential is security. In a collapse, the credential can become a silent relic of a world that no longer hires the way it once did. The fifth purchase is the broad category of consumer lifestyle goods bought on credit. This category is revealing because it exposes how much of modern life is really a financing arrangement misread as identity. Home theater systems, designer furniture, electronics, renovations, the extra room you did not need but could finance, the upgraded kitchen, the clothes, the appliances, the beautifully curated weight of a life that assumed the future would continue arriving in the same currency, with the same income. Through the same retail channels, the public thinks of this as consumption. In collapse, it reveals itself as stranded capital. Zimbabwe showed the most extreme form. People spent rapidly because holding currency was suicidal. They bought whatever they could. Physical goods felt safer than money. Then the goods wore out, broke, or lost resale value inside an economy too broken to maintain them. Lebanon showed a softer but equally cruel version. Credit-fueled consumer life suddenly sat inside a collapsing currency regime. The debts remained, the salary did not keep pace. The objects themselves did not solve the new problem, which was survival, liquidity, and flexibility. That is what consumer goods become in a collapse, not assets weight. This is where people misunderstand the nature of resilience. They think that having a house full of things means they are rich in some practical sense, maybe in a stable consumer economy for a while. In a breakdown, the value of many things converges toward their use under stress. Can it feed you? Can it generate income? Can it preserve purchasing power? Can it travel? Can it be repaired? Can it be traded? Can it reduce dependence? If the answer is no, the object may still be pleasant, but it is not resilient. That is the standard that matters. A finance sofa may be beautiful. It is not resilience. A state of the art entertainment system may be expensive. It is not resilience. A designer renovation may impress your friends. It is not resilience. The middle class confuses finished consumption with completed security. Collapse tears that illusion apart. Now step back and look at the pattern across all 5 categories. Wrong cycle leveraged real estate. New automobiles bought on credit. Long-term paper promises, credentials tied to a formal labor market. Consumer goods financed as identity. These are not random failures. They are the exact architecture of middle class life in a stable financial order. That is why collapse hits the middle class with such precision. The rich often hold claims with optionality, liquidity, direct ownership, foreign diversification, real assets, or enough flexibility to move. The poor often have too little exposure to the formal promise machinery to lose much in relative terms. The middle class is the class that believed most deeply. It borrowed for the right things, it signed the right forms, it played by the rules. It trusted that the structure was robust enough to reward compliance. That is why collapse hits it surgically. Not because collapse hates virtue, because middle-class virtue is usually expressed through delayed institutional trust. And institutional trust is exactly what breaks. That is the hidden architecture. A mortgage is a bet on system continuity. A financed car is a bet on system continuity. A pension is a bet on system continuity. A degree is a bet on system continuity. A debt-funded lifestyle is a bet on system continuity. 1 or 2 such bets may be manageable. Most middle-class households stack all 5 at once. That is concentrated exposure disguised as normal life. The system itself encourages this because the system earns fees, taxes, growth, and political calm from households that turn themselves into long chains of institutional dependency. That is the part nobody likes hearing. The structure does not merely allow the middle class to become exposed. It quietly encourages it. Buy, borrow, lock in, extend, commit, upgrade. The future will be there. The future will honor the contract. The currency will hold. The labor market will reward the credential. The bank will always open. The state will always manage the pension. Honestly, the tax bill will remain reasonable. The buyer will always exist. These are the lullabies of the formal economy. They sound wise until the music stops. I am not telling you every house is a mistake. I am not telling you never to get an education. I am not telling you to reject all insurance or every form of retirement planning. I am telling you something more difficult and more useful. Every major purchase is also a systems bet. That is the truth. Most people are never taught. If you buy a home with a 30-year mortgage, you are not merely buying shelter. You are betting on stable income, stable financing, stable taxes, stable resale conditions, and a government that will not become desperate enough to change the operating assumptions under your feet. If you buy a new car on a 5-year loan, you are betting on fuel, parts, roads, and your continued ability to service the debt. If you pay into a pension, annuity, or insurance contract, you are betting on institutional solvency, regulatory continuity, and future purchasing power. If you borrow for a degree, you are betting on a functioning labor market aligned with your credential. If you load your household with finance lifestyle goods, you are betting that the future will remain rich enough, liquid enough, and peaceful enough for those goods to matter. Those are all bets, not necessarily foolish bets in stable times, but bets, and the most dangerous financial position in the world is not one risky bet. It is 5 respectable bets layered on top of the same hidden assumption, the assumption that the system will remain fundamentally normal. History is very unkind to that assumption, not always, but often enough that any serious adult should at least recognize the pattern. Weimar Argentina, Japan, Greece, Spain, Lebanon, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, the Soviet collapse, different countries, different governments, different cultures, different currencies. The same broad mechanism, the relationship between money and reality breaks. And once that relationship breaks, the purchases most dependent on systemic continuity stop delivering what they promised. Fay file site Fay turn 27 file 0 Fay. That is why the historical frequency matters so much. Financial crises are not meteor strikes. They are regular enough across modern history that treating systemic stability as a permanent guarantee is not prudence. It is complacency. Now, what did the survivors of these episodes have in common? Not prophecy, not genius, not a magical ability to predict dates. They tended to preserve liquidity. They avoided overconcentration in one currency, one institution, one asset class, one promise chain. They maintained optionality. They distinguished between consumption and resilience. And above all, they understood that the rules can change faster than the brochures ever suggested. That is a very different mindset from the one consumer capitalism encourages. Consumer capitalism says buy the life first and assume the system will make it make sense later. History says build resilience first and assume the system may someday demand proof. That is the real dividing line. Now let me end where people actually live. Imagine a woman standing in a quiet apartment. After the worst part of the crisis has technically passed, her home still exists, but it is worth far less and cannot be sold on good terms. Her car still sits outside, but it costs too much to run and no longer solves what she thought it solved. Her insurance contract paid, but the money did not matter by the time it came. Her degree still hangs on the wall, but the market that once paid for that credential has shrunk or vanished. Her rooms still contain the nice things she spent years accumulating, but those things cannot pay taxes, buy food, preserve dignity, or restore optionality. She is not ruined in the cinematic sense. She is not on fire. She is not in a war zone. She is something else. She is stranded. And stranded is the quiet face of middle-class destruction. That is why I am so serious about this, because the most dangerous purchases are not always the flashy ones. Very often they are the ones everybody praised as mature, stable, and responsible precisely because they were built on the same fragile foundation. You do not need to become paranoid to see that. You only need to become honest. So here is the final choice. You can keep looking at the 5 pillars of middle-class life and treating them as permanent proof of security, simply because the system still works well enough today to flatter that belief. You can keep assuming that houses are always assets, finance cars are always useful, long-term paper promises are always dependable, degrees are always economic protection, and consumer purchases always represent progress. Many will. Or you can do the harder thing. You can ask what conditions each purchase truly depends on. You can stop confusing ownership with resilience. You can stop confusing consumption with optionality. You can stop confusing compliance with protection. And you can begin judging your life not only by what it contains, but by what would still function if the system around it lost its smoothness. That is the better question, because collapse does not usually begin by taking your things away. It begins by taking their usefulness away, and the people who understand that before the usefulness disappears are the ones who still have choices left when everyone else is just standing in a room full of stranded purchases, wondering why every responsible decision they made now feels like a trap.